welcome everybody to the first CJS lecture of the winter 2021 semester in the CJS lecture series. I am Marcus Nornis from ALC and Film, TV, and Media Studies. And if you want to see what else is scheduled for the series this semester, please check the CJS events page or various social media. I hope you're in on it if you aren't already. Next week, we're going to have a lecture by Chihiru Tajima, who's an associate professor of intercultural studies at Gakushuin Women's College in Tokyo. She'll be discussing Japanese undergraduate students' study abroad for language and cultural learning. So today, I am really excited to introduce you to Daisuke Miyao, who's the professor and Hajime Mori Chair in Japanese Language and Literature at UC San Diego. And I count him as one of the very finest scholars in my field, Japanese cinema. His scholarship engages issues of transnational cinema without feeling trendy at all. He's taken some brilliant and unusual tacks on this, exploring the technological, cultural, personal, and aesthetic movements that are happening across both oceans and continents. And this book, indeed, and this is actually the context for his new book, Japonisme and the Birth of Cinema. His first book was Sessue Hayakawa, Silent Cinema and Transnational Stardom, which was about one of the great stars of the silent and early sound cinema who circulated between Hollywood and Japanese film worlds. And he followed this up with a powerful look into the early decades of cinematography and his aesthetics of shadow, lighting in Japanese cinema. And here again, there are these really important links between American cinema and Japanese cinema. It's a really creative and absolutely fascinating book. He also wrote an introductory textbook to film studies called Cinema is a Cat lover's introduction to film studies. And essentially, every example he uses from cinema in that book involves at least one cat. So before him, we have a cat lover in the room. I wish that he could literally be in the room with us in Ann Arbor, but I'm thrilled that he's joining us virtually today to talk about his wonderful new book. So Daisuke, take it away.
Thank you, Marcus, for your very generous introduction. I'm honored to be here. I feel very privileged to be a part of this seminar series. And I'd like to thank Marcus for your continuous support for my research since the very beginning of my career. It was 2003, as far as I remember, when we did the translation of Ozu book by Kiju Yoshida, which was published from the University of Michigan. And I am truly grateful for those opportunities in which we work together. And I hope someday after this situation improves, I'd like to visit University of Michigan in person and look at the big house, the topic of your film that we watched together in San Diego a few years ago. Can I share my screen now? Okay. So do you see my screen now? Okay.
Yeah.
PowerPoint. Great. Okay. As Marcus has kindly introduced, today's talk is about my new book, Japonism and the Birth of Cinema, which was published last year from Duke University Press. In this book, I talk about the relationship between Japonism and the very beginning of the history of cinema. Well, Japonism is a term to describe the impact of Japanese art and culture upon the European and eventually the American culture and art in general. Well, if you can think of manga and anime of these days, you may be able to feel the impact that the Japanese culture and art had in the late 19th century. Lots of artists from painters, sculptors, architects, and so on and so forth, they felt really fascinated by the Japanese art and the cultural forms that came into Europe and in the United States in the late 19th century after Japan opened its door to the international relations in the 1850s. In this book, though, I am expand that scope, the impact of Japanese culture and art forms to the history of cinema, which hasn't been really explored by any scholars so far. My focus is on the films of Lumière brothers. They are considered to be one of the, or two of the inventors of cinema. They screened their first films in Paris on December 28th of 1895, about 125 years ago. And they were in the midst of the vogue of Japonism when they were making their films. So my research started in, well, I exactly know when this research started, actually. It was 2012, when I had a chance to spend my sabbatical year in Lyon, France. My previous institution, the University of Oregon, has a student exchange program between, with the University of Lyon. So I was able to teach a course at Université Jean-Moulin Lyon 3 in 2012 to 13. And as a film historian, the first place that I went in Lyon was the famous factory of the Miyao brothers, where they made their first films. And they have their own archive now, Institut Lumière. And I started watching their films one by one, and I was instantly hooked because of the fascinating contents in them. So my argument in this book is based on my actual viewing of more than 1,000, well, actually 1,428 films that I saw in Institut Lumière. Well, most of them are less than 1 minute long, so, but still it took some time for me to watch all of them. But anyhow, I'd like to talk about 3 films today. But I'm not, taking 6 hours or anything like that. Like I said, each of those films are less than 1 minute long. So yeah, I'd like to show some films by the Lumière brothers and one Japanese film that has a very close relationship with the Lumière brothers. So I'd like to start with the first film. Sharing and share screen, desktop. Okay. So I'd like to show you a film which is about the Eiffel Tower in Paris. This film is used, the screen grab from this film is used as the cover of my book. When I watched Lumière films, I was, of course, interested in the content, the actual subject matter of those films, the films that captured the everyday lives of the late 19th century France and the world. But at the same time, I was fascinated by the other elements in that film. Composition is one of them. So when you watch this film, I'd like you to pay attention to the composition of this film. At the same time, when I was watching these films, I became really conscious about how my eyes look at these images. So, these films are fascinating to me because of the sense of, physiological sense of my body. So how my eyes, look at these images. So not only as the text, but also I was interested in these films or the relationship or even communication between the images and my body. So I'd like to show you this film as an example of Lumière cinema and its relationship to Japonism. Okay. Did you notice anything Japanese in this film? This film was shot in 1897 or 1898. Cinematographer from the company of the Lumière brothers placed a motion picture camera called the Cinematography Lumière in an elevator of the Eiffel Tower. This film, known as Panoramic View during Ascension of the Eiffel Tower, is a visual record of a modern technological experiences. A view from an electrically operated fast machine that takes a rider to the top of a metal tower. Well, many films that the Lumière brothers produced were often called actualité or the actuality film that uses footage of such current events, places, and things as French ceremonies, military parades, president's visit to various locations, and travelogue footages of foreign countries. So a historian said that the Lumière film like this was, quote, nothing more than motion picture snapshots that were the recording of unadjusted, unarranged, untampered reality, end of quote. But if we look a little closer, this film is not just a recording of actuality. The composition of this film is very attractive, isn't it? The Lumière brothers were conscious about the composition. They insisted that photography could become an art form because the composition had artistic effects. In their 1894 essay, so that was before the screening of any of their films on photography, they argued that the composition and chiaroscuro should be satisfactory in order for a tableau to formulate a good impression, and that their first priority was composition, that it would contain unity and balance. As you saw, the film is basically divided into two layers, two planes. In the first, numerous metal bars that from the tower moving across the frame from the top to the bottom. And in the second layer, the background, the Palais du Trocadero comes in and out of sight and gradually changes its position because of the change of the viewing position of the camera. Eventually, the Seine River also becomes visible at the bottom of the frame. If we juxtapose, as you see, if we juxtapose this film with the work of Henri Rivière, for instance, we realize that the Lumière brothers films were not simply actuality films. So when I watched this film for the first time, I didn't know about the work of Henri Rivière, but I was, intuitively thinking about the composition of ukiyo-e paintings, if I recall. So when I discovered the work of Henri Rivière, I was simply astonished. Okay, so my intuition was not so wrong. Heavily influenced by Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock plinths, Henri Rivière recorded the building of the Eiffel Tower with a series of 36 sketches from 1888 throughout the 1890s. The work was based on Katsushika Hokusai's popular serial of ukiyo-e prints, 36 Views of Mount Fuji, Fugak 36. It was made around 1830. Like Rivière, the Lumière brothers used motion picture cameras to depict the world in the way that Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock plinths did. That's what I kind of discovered. And ukiyo-e was the representative of Japonism in France. It had a huge impact on European art. The most visible impact was the composition of paintings, as you are seeing. The dominant mode of painting in Europe since the Renaissance era was the linear perspective. The linear perspective is based on the belief that the human can depict the world in an objective manner. The technique of the vanishing point was invented for that purpose. As you see in this famous painting by Velázquez, Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, they talked about these paintings in detail. So if you are interested, you can go to their writings. And in any case, different sizes of things exist in different planes in this painting that fully utilized or even experimentally explore the purpose of the linear perspective painting. Japanese paintings like ukiyo-e challenged this dominant technique and viewpoint in European art. Young and ambitious artists were hugely attracted by ukiyo-e paintings, like impressionist painters like Monet, and post-impressionist painters like Van Gogh. Marcus is used in the background of Van Gogh's famous Japonism painting in today's introduction. So they turned to ukiyo-e. And to me, in addition to the composition that overemphasized the contrast between the front and the back, to challenge the linear perspective, what these painters valued most in Japanese prints was their methods of capturing moments and movements instantly. The paintings with linear perspective do not often depict movements. They're like still images. The human eyes do not look at the world in stillness though. Linear perspective is not real if we think about the actual unstable, transient ways that our eyes move. Well, if you look at your index finger, for example, if you try to do that, you really need to focus on this one point. Otherwise, your eyes move around, become transient, very easily. You can do that experiment very easily. In contrast, the Impressionism was particularly conscious of how human eyes work. They move side by side, side to side, back and forth. And Claude Monet, for example, experimented how to realistically capture the movements of our eyes in his paintings, including Le Planton à travers les branches. The art historian Mabuchi Akiko writes on Monet, quote, "When we look at a view through things such as a screen, bamboo trees, and tree leaves, which exist right in front of us, our eyes initially focus on the things that obstruct our vision, and then our focal length switches to the world behind. More strictly speaking, our focal points constantly change in accordance with the distance between us and every single object." Monet's attempt was to express the physiological sense of vision, as you see in this painting, for example. It is true that the composition of this painting to that of Jean-Baptiste Collot's painting, the collection of Montfontaine, it's 1864 painting, which preserved the linear perspective. Monet did not include anything but the tree leaves in the front plane, while Collot painted the entire tree as well as some people on the ground right next to the tree. As a result, Monet's work enhanced the distinction between the front and the back. By doing so, Monet created a sense of space by making the eye move actively from one tilted horizontal plane to the next. Monet did not only express his sense of vision, but also attempted to mobilize the gaze of the spectator and invite their eyes to explore the whole visual field within the frame, or even to the point of leading the eye out of the painting. Monet was also aware of recent development in physiology. In 1878, for example, the French scientist Louis-Émile Javel formalized an understanding that vision occurs in terms of short, fast jumps, which he termed saccadic movements. So if you look at, when we look at a famous painting by George Seurat, for example, our eyes don't focus on one point or one layer, but move around as, like this, saccadic eye movements. Like Impressionist painters, so my argument is that like Impressionist painters, Lumière brothers, their contemporaries were influenced by Japonism and experimented the compositions as well as the realism of human eyes with their movie camera. So that's one issue that I was really interested in, the connection between Japan, Japonism, and the birth of cinema, especially the Lumière films. But I want to switch gears here and turn to the second film. Okay. Let me show you my second film. So this is a film that one of the
can you position the video a little on the left-hand side?
Oh, left-hand side. Okay. Here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So the Lumière companies, they sent out about 100 cinematographers to all over the world to capture exotic images and bring them back to France. And this is one of those films that was photographed in Japan. There's one Japanese person who had a very close relationship with the Lumière brothers, Inabata Katsutaro, in this film. But that fact is not really important in this particular film. What I want you to pay attention to is his action. Well, there are several strange elements in this film that you may notice. At least 1, 2, maybe 3 elements that you may notice, the strange things in this film that is titled The Japanese Meal, Repasanfa Meal. Okay, so I want to show you this very short film here. Okay. Did you notice something strange? Well, like I said, the Lumière company sent out numerous cinematographers to all over the world and collected repertoire of films for screenings in France. Motion picture camera had an important function to capture, catalog, and display people and sites of the world in immediate and in an actual manner, like the news TV today. And the Lumière company sent 2 prominent cinematographers to Japan back to back. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. Okay. So they sent out these 2 guys, Constant Jurel and Gabriel Vell, to Japan. Gabriel Vell Constant Jurel in 1897 and Gabriel Vell in 1898. There are 33 films photographed in Japan in the Lumière catalog, which consists of, like I said, more than 1,400 films. Since no film was shot in other parts of Asia except French Indochina, it is unusual to have 33 films shot in Japan. Japonism was probably the main reason again. But a personal connection was another reason. Like I said, the Lumière brothers had a Japanese classmate at La Martinière High School in Lyon, France. His name was Inabata Katsutaro. Inabata was sent to Lyon by the Kyoto prefecture to study the famous silk industry in Lyon. And after he went back to Japan, he became the big name in the silk industry in Japan, rising silk industry in Japan. Before and after visiting Japan, both Jurel and Vell photographed the coronation of the Russian Emperor Nikolai II, the maneuvers of German army, the party of the President of Mexico, and the official ceremony of Cambodian king in French Indochina, and so on and so forth. But the official events. This was the Lumière company's strategy to make their product authorized and legitimate. But in Japan, they did not photograph political events, governmental officials, or anything like that. And instead, what they captured appeared to be everyday scenes of Japan. For instance, there is a film called Hepazan Family Meal. And Inabata Katsutaro, as you saw, appeared in this film. And I want to talk about those strange things. First of all, despite the title, The Family Meal, nobody in this film eats anything at all. Inabata sips some tea and smokes a little bit. And the 2 infants are forced to drink some tea, and that's all. The dish placed in front of Inabata is not a food dish, but a brazier. No Japanese filmmaker will title this film A Family Meal because nobody eats. By the end of the 19th century, the images of the Japanese meal had already existed in Europe in the vogue of Japonism. So there were a series of paintings, drawings, and photographs of the Japanese meal. For instance, there was a photograph, Gozen Meal Time, that appeared in an English journal, The Far East, in 1873. Young parents or mother and an older brother are giving a meal to their baby. The image of wearing kimono, sitting on the floor and eating rice must have had an exotic appeal. And Jurel himself played a Japanese character in a photograph about a family meal here. So Jurel's film was nothing new in this artistic archive of exotic Japanese meal, or the sense of exoticism that existed in the visual archive of Japonism before the Lumière company sent out those cinematographers to Japan. So this is kind of like a fantasy realized by using the actual Japanese landscape and the people by these 2 cinematographers. The film version provided a unique opportunity for the audience to see actual Japanese people, quote unquote, having a meal over time in an animated version or animated duration. And we can add more observation to this film about those strange things, if you noticed those. I might call this film captured the dialogic moment between the photographer and the photographed. During the short duration of the film, Inabata receives a teacup from the woman at the left and woman on the left and bows to her deeply. The woman was the maid of the house, and it was not appropriate for the master of the house to respectfully bow to his maid, usually, if this film is an actualité or actuality film. More curiously, after bowing to her, Inabata directly looks towards the camera. Most likely, cinematographer Constant Drell wanted to include the ritualistic behavior of bowing in Japan in the film. And Inabata was asking him if it was okay, if that was okay, his performance was okay. In that sense, this film was not a document of a daily scene of a meal for a Japanese family. We could say that Inabata and his family were performing in this film, in which Drell wanted to display his idea of a Japanese family having a meal, his fantasy, Orientalistic or Japonism fantasy. Inabata understood Drell's desire and tried to bring a perfect performance for this film, so to speak. Such a dialogic moment had been difficult to capture in paintings or photographs. In cinema, we view the object in time. Despite Drell's intermediate or immediate desire to reproduce an exotic image of Japan, in other visual media, his film displays the moment of contingency, so to speak. His film didn't simply represent what was considered to be a Japanese culture, but visually recorded duration of an encounter between the subject and object of a gaze. Similarly, Gabriel Veil's film, I don't have a clip of this film, which is not available publicly. I only have the photograph, still photograph. But similarly, Gabriel Veil's film, Chanteuse Japanese Singer, replicated Japanism painting by Charles Bergman or Edward Atkinson Hono. Veil wrote about Japanese women. Quote, in order to fully understand the social status of Japanese women, we need to completely wipe out the sense of Western morality from our minds. Japanese girls are extremely attractive because they combine decency and indecency, obedience and obscenity. Of course, it's a very, exotic, orientalistic, sexist, racist claim. But in his film like this, Gabriel Veil, recreated his fantasy using the actual Japanese people and landscape. Indeed, almost all the women in the films by Jirao and Veil are geisha, except the Inabata's family and just a few others. It is not surprising if there were people who believed that most of the Japanese women were geisha, the people in France, if they only saw those paintings and these films. But I want to draw your attention to the hesitant smile of this anonymous Japanese singer. Her smile could have been caused by the sense of loss in front of the recording machine that she was not familiar with. Her unexpected smile captured her in reality. The film showed a moment when she revealed her real self with an authentic human body, no matter how powerfully the cinematographer tried to reflect his geisha fantasy on her. But her action after that moment of dismay signified that she ended up playing the role of a cheerful and obedient geisha for the male gaze of Gabriel Veil. In other words, she started to address ostensibly the observer with gestures, playing the samisen and singing her continuous performance indicated her acknowledgement of the gaze of the observer and her response of catering to that gaze as a geisha. And let's turn to the third film, if we have time. Okay. So the third film that I want to show you, this is not a Lumière film, but a film that is considered to be the oldest surviving Japanese film, which is called Momijigari, or Maple Viewing. This film was shot by a Japanese cinematographer whose name is Shibata Tsunekichi. I want to question, though, well, this film has a status of an important cultural property of Japan, Juyo Bunkazai in Japan, because of its content, because of the fact that this film is the oldest surviving Japanese film. But I want to question this, adjective, Japanese, how Japanese this film was. This is a reproduction of a famous kabuki stage. Two prominent actors appeared in this film, Ichikawa Danjuro and Onoe Kikugoro. But if we think about the context of Japanism of this period, we may want to question how Japanese this film was. That's I want to argue. But in any case, I want to show you this film first. So this is like I said, a reproduction of kabuki stage of Momijigari, or Maple Viewing. It's based on a famous No play about a Japanese samurai who wanders in the mountain of Mount Togakushi, and the samurai encounters a beautiful woman singing and dancing. And he drinks some sake and enjoys her performance. But in his dream, a god appears and reveals that, this woman is not actually a beautiful woman, but a monster of Mount Togakushi. And so in the second sequence, there is a battle between the samurai and the monster. So this is Danjuro Ichikawa performing a beautiful woman in Mount Togakushi. So now the samurai is fighting against this monster. So the person on the right, the same Ichikawa Danjuro, now he's performing a monster with the long hair. Okay. So there was a Japanese cameraman. So this film, Momijigari, or Maple Viewing, was shot by Shibata Tsunekichi, a Japanese cinematographer. He used to be Lumière. he used Lumière cinematograph, the movie motion picture camera of the Lumière company, and documented the streets of Tokyo right after Constant Girel left Japan. So he was one of the first cinematographers in Japan who used, those imported motion picture cameras to capture the scenes in Japan. So before he made this film, Maple Viewing. So Maple Viewing was 1899. So even before that, he shot some scenes of Japan. He documented the street of Tokyo that were rapidly westernizing. In his films, using cinematograph Lumière, some store names on the famous street of Ginza written in alphabet, as you see here, Hattori, now Seiko, Hattori Seiko, the watch company, clock company, the name is written in alphabet here. Japanese people in Western clothes, some of them, and using Western style umbrella, walking on the street. Probably cinematographers like Constant Girel and Gabriel Vale would avoid such scenes of transforming Japan because their films kind of realize their Orientalistic fantasy of non-changing traditional scenes. Gabriel Vale wrote in his diary, for example, quote, "Whenever I go through a city, I see too many vulgar derby hats. They abandon the beautifully unique hairstyle that they have succeeded from their ancestors and imitating Western hats. There are policemen wearing Western style uniforms that do not fit everywhere to anywhere. There still are delicate and beautiful wooden houses, but many of them are at the verge of being replaced by non-stylistic and gigantic concrete buildings." End of quote. So, but Shibata showed both of them, Japanese people in traditional kimonos and Japanese buildings, according to Vale, very vulgar. But Shibata didn't simply document the streets of Japan either. He was sensible and sensitive enough about the expectation of the owner of the camera. He chose streets where an emperor's palace, for example, in this one, emperor's palace, would be visible, and trees of cherry blossoms and rickshaws, Japanese national flower cherry blossoms, are in full bloom. He was also carefully selecting what to be photographed in that sense. There's an interesting mix of exoticism and modernization in his films. So if we think about that context of Shibata juxtaposing traditionality or Orientalistic views of Japan and modernization, westernization, this film, Momijigari, the film by Shibata that I showed, the film captured the performance of two acclaimed kabuki actors, like I said, Ichikawa Danjuro and Onoe Kikugoro, performing Maple Viewing. Danjuro appeared as the Princess Sarashina Hime, and Onoe Kikugoro was playing the samurai Taira no Koremochi. In the play, the samurai is invited by beautiful women, including Sarashina Hime, to a Maple Viewing party at Mount Togakushi. He enjoyed sake while watching the women dance. When he falls asleep, a god appears in his dream, and the god reveals to Koremochi that the women are in fact monsters in disguise, and leaves him a sacred sword, and Kenmochi wakes up and exterminates the monsters with the sword. The Japanese Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology designated this film, Momijigari, to be an important cultural property, Juyo Bunkazai, in 2009, making it the first film to receive the designation. So the Japanese government officially considers Momijigari to have captured the important cultural property of Japan. But like I said, I think the film was not a simple depiction of Japanese art. It was shot by Shibata, who had been conscious of making films for exoticism, seeking non-Japanese viewers outside of Japan, who had been appreciating the art of Japan, Japanism. I want to make an interesting connection here. Claude Monet exhibited his painting, La Japonaise, Camille Monet in Japanese Costume, 1876, at the Second Impressionist exhibition in Paris in the midst of Japonism. In the painting, Monet's wife, Camille, poses in a vividly red kimono in front of a wall filled with a number of Japanese fans. The major motif of the kimono in a fierce-looking samurai who is about to draw his sword. On the red kimono, we also see a number of maple leaves floating above the samurai's figure. The design of the kimono in La Japonaise was most likely based on momijigari, which had been exported to Europe in various forms, ukiyo-e, design, and so on and so forth. One example is Tsukioka Yoshitoshi's work on momijigari, titled Taira no Koremochi Togakushiyama Kijo Taijinozu, the image of Taira no Koremochi exterminating a monster woman at Mount Togakushi. In this work by Yoshitoshi, not only is the posture of the samurai almost exactly the same as in Monet's La Japonaise, but the colors of the samurai's dress, the blue-green kimono and the blue hakama, are similarly contrasted with the vivid red dress of the woman behind him. Yukitoshi's work was completed in 1887, which was after La Japonaise, so it is not known whether Yoshitoshi, only 1 year older than Monet, was familiar with La Japonaise, but the resemblance between these two seems too striking to be accidental. Even if Monet was not familiar with the play and the ukiyo-e of momijigari, it is quite certain that he saw a kimono with the samurai motif in Europe. Quite a number of kimonos used by geisha were exported to France during the period of Japonism, and the motifs from momijigari presumably came with them. Monet talked about La Japonaise to an art dealer and said, quote, "I had a chance to look at an excellent dress and was recommended to paint it. Embroidery is done with golden threads, and some parts are as thick as few inches," end of quote. So Monet had a great chance to familiarize himself with the motif of momijigari without even knowing it. Then he made European spectators aware of the motif of his famous paintings. In such a context, I think it was logical for Shibata to consider his film Momijigari, Maple Viewing, as a film for export for European spectators, especially to the 1900 Paris International Exposition, in which the Japanese government was officially participated and selecting the work to be exported. So 1899, when Momijigari was photographed by Shibata, Shibata might have been thinking about using it for the purpose of the export that the Japanese government was officially thinking of to the 1900 Paris Exposition that happened in the midst of the Japanese vogue. It is also said that the producers of the film, Inoue Takejiro, the head of the Kabukiza Theater, was serious about exporting this film to Europe. So Shibata wouldn't have said no to his idea. So as for the third film that I have shown, even though it is considered to be the oldest surviving Japanese film, this Japanese might have been not the actual representation of Japan, but the producers of this film is considering Japan or the Japanese that was catering to the fantastic or Orientalistic fantasy of the Japanese, of the French audience who are already experiencing the vogue of Japanism. So that concludes my talk here, and I am extensively explaining the background of those three films and beyond in my book. So I hope you have a chance to look at those profound explanations and the arguments in my book. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Daisuke. Thank you very much. I'm sure everyone's giving you a big round of applause that you can't hear or see. I just wanted to mention for those of you watching on Zoom that the movies look better than they did actually. The Zoom is just the worst platform for showing clips. It was
Right.
dropping lots of frames. The movement is quite smooth in this actually.
Mhm.
So we have a couple questions, but I'm going to kick it off. Actually, I'm really interested in the whole eye saccading thing, which I'm writing about. I know Reggie is writing about this relationship of representation in the body, but I want to ask you about something a little bit different. And that has to do with Noel Birch's book, To the Distant Observer, because if you think about, for those of you who don't know, this is a really foundational book for the study of Japanese cinema, it came out the same year as Edward Said's Orientalism and got roundly slammed. But CJS actually reprinted it through CJS pubs. So you can look at it for free there. I think it's really interesting, and it echoes against your work in some interesting ways because Birch, he divides representation broadly into presentational versus representational, the latter being the Renaissance space perspective that you were talking about with the vanishing point. And then presentational, he identifies with more flat kinds of representation, like the Japanese older arts, or for him, traditional arts, like woodblock painting. And then he jumps to cinema to do something quite radical, which was to combine the Lumieres, who you're looking at, and Méliès, who does the first fiction films, which are all about magic and tricks. He combines them, which is kind of shocking, and counterposes them to the Americans, who are doing a kind of cinema based on vanishing point and the reproduction of life. So this is kind of very similar to what you're talking about, because Birch was also aligning these traditional Japanese arts with the avant-garde, and he's also interested, like you, in notions of influence, which he wants to complicate and reveal the imperialist and geopolitical nature of some of those ideas about representation. The thing is, when I looked at your bibliography, you only cite Birch's Life to Those Shadows, and you kind of skip over To the Distant Observer. So that was a little long, but I just really would love to hear you position yourself in relationship to this really huge, important work in Japanese film studies.
Right. Yeah, I cannot agree with you more. Yeah, there are lots of parallels and the similarities between my work here and Birch's work. Well, one way to answer or to respond to your comments is that I am kind of saving to discuss Birch for my for my next work.
That's good to know. I like hearing that.
I'm thinking about doing some work on post-World War II French attraction to Japanese cinema in a slightly different context, right? I'm thinking about those films by Nouvelle Vague or French New Wave filmmakers, who are so very attracted to Japanese, elements,
Yes.
not just the contents, but also the references, right? Godard,
Yeah.
Rivette, and Dumi,
Bazin too.
Michael, to name a few, right?
Yeah.
And I'd like to think about, this attraction of post-war French people to Japan, including Birch and of course Roland Barthes in the same context. There, I think the things become more philosophical and pseudoly orientalistic. Whereas what I'm discussing in this book is more about, physiological and scientific, so to speak, that Birch doesn't really go into, right? So the connection that I'm trying to make in this book is the these Lumière brothers and the contemporaneous scientists and physiologicians, so to speak, especially in chapter 1. So that's what I want to do. So I am curious what you are writing about, this physiology of the eyes, and your students writing about this bodily reaction to films like Lumière. Because like I said at the very beginning of today's talk, I was not just interested in the text of these films, but the perception or the communication between my body and these films, because I was just truly fascinated by how my eyes are looking for several different elements in Lumière cinema. So. Yep. I think that differentiates my view and the Birch is doing in To the Distant Observer.
That's a great thing to hear. That what a wonderful topic. I can't wait to see this next book. Write it soon. So let's turn to the questions from the audience. The first is a question. It's not a question. It's actually just praise for your Melville posters in back. We got a French film fan here.
Yeah.
And that's from Lewis. Allison asks, she writes, "Thank you for this fascinating talk. I look forward to reading your new book, and I wonder if we know anything about the moments when these films were made. So did the people in the films have an opportunity to watch the recordings, for example? Did they have any idea what was going on? I mean, was film so new that perhaps they weren't fully understanding how their images would be seen later? And your point about the geisha smile prompted my questions. I started wondering how she understood the moment."
Well, as I mentioned briefly, I don't think she understood what was going on. She might have aware of, they are using a recording device or something, because some of the Japanese people are familiar with photographs already. I talk about Yokohama photographs in chapter 2 of my book, which utilize the, or emphasize or enhance the exoticism of the Japanese landscape. It became, a kind of a souvenir photographs for European people who came to Japan in the late 19th century. But in the case of this Japanese woman who posed for Gabriel Vale films, I don't think they understood what was really going on. So the hesitant smile that I talked about, it's more about the smile of dismay. And I don't think, they have, well, they might have seen the films later in Japan because cinema became really, really popular as one of the, Misamono entertainments in Japan in the early 20th century. But at that point, at that particular point of 1898, 1897, I don't think they understood what was going on. That's a very fascinating part of the relationship between the cinematographer and the object of their gazes. Nowadays, that kind of relationships, and it's impossible to happen. So.
Yeah, I mean, the historians have done an amazing job of pinpointing exactly when these films were shown, where they were shown, and and what was shown. But so you could probably line up when this was shot in relationship to screenings that had taken place. But
yeah, Tsukada Yoshinobu's work, for example.
After that, it'd be guessing.
Yeah.
Jeffrey has a question. He says, "Thanks for the presentation, Daisuke. Good to see you."
Great to see you. I mean,
it was interesting,
but
it was interesting to see how the cameraman manipulated the exotic scenes of Japan that they filmed. Clear Orientalism. I'm curious to know how Japonisme was mobilized in selling the films to Western audiences, not just making them. Did the Lumiere brothers leave documents, articles, or advertisements that explain the large number of films they were making in Japan? Did they explicitly explain, justify, or defend the fantasies that they were making and promoting?
Frankly, no. I looked into the available Lumière writings and diaries and so on and so forth, but they don't talk about the attraction to Japan at all. The only things that we can find is the diaries of Gabriel Vale and some writings by Constant Girel, who actually went to Japan. So as for Lumiere brothers, they don't really talk about Japan per se, Japanism per se. So in that sense, this book is the most experimental work that I have ever done, because before this book, the actual phenomena were already there. The huge stardom and popularity of Sessue Hayakawa. It was there. So what I did was how and why that happened. And the aesthetics of shadow, that was there, the attempt of Japanese cinematographers to create, this sense of shadowiness or darkness in cinema. It was already there. So I was, trying to figure out why and how. But in this case, not many people have, discussed Lumière cinema in terms of Japanism. So it is me who is trying to make the connection by looking deeply into the text and the context behind these films. So in that sense, there's no clear advertisement or publicity of Japan or Japanism from the part of the Lumière brothers. But as I argued in today's talk, for example, I think there is a clear connection between them, and there are ways to discuss that. The mobilization of our eyes, physiology is one way to do that, and there should be more ways to do so. Yeah.
Yeah, in the other books, Daisuke is an amazing historian, and you had much richer archives to work with the previous books, where your subjects were explaining what they were doing too in all sorts of different fora, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here's Matthew Solomon asks. He says, "Great talk, very thought-provoking, and please tell Daisuke that Martin Barnier sends his regards from Lyon."
Thank you. Yeah, Martin Barnier. Yeah, he's a professor of Lyon 2, and well, actually, we are planning to write a book on Jacques Demy together.
Oh wow!
Martin is an expert in film music, so he's writing on music to me, and I'm thinking about transnational aspect of Demy's films. So.
And Matthew asks, what do we know about the Eiffel Tower elevator? In other words, what other views were available from the lift? I'm thinking of another Lumière film shot nearby, also with a moving camera, the moving sidewalk at the 1900 Paris Exposition.
Yes. There are many ways to capture Eiffel Tower and the movements around Eiffel Tower. There is an American film that also placed a camera inside of the Eiffel Tower, which is preserved at the Library of Congress. But the composition in that film is not really, this juxtaposition of the frontal and in the background in a strong contrast. It's more geared toward the three-dimensionality of the composition. So I didn't really talk about other, influence of Japan. I mean, the influence of Japan to other cinema, other than Lumière films. But I want to explore, the relationship between, American ways of, capturing. Well, I touched upon the issues of the triangular relationship between Japan, France, and the United States in the epilogue of this book by way of connecting, the popularity of Sessue Hayakawa and his films, and how his films are influenced by the French Japonism as well. So yeah, there are more to explore, triangulation of Japanese among those three countries are, one huge way to explore as well.
We have a question from your neighbor, Anne McKnight, who's in the room.
Hi, Anne.
She says, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I was interested in the space of the everyday that's being actualized, performed. As you know, there's some interesting scholarship on the everyday and bunka eiga, or culture film, as ethnography, as colonial collecting. She's thinking of Fujijinshi, for example, mentions me. And it's usually presented as emerging out of post-1937 changes in the industry. But your presentation suggests that ways of looking have a very long history. This might be a bit of a jump, but do you see any connections between these Japan Lumière productions and the later bunka-eiga in the staging or composition or anything else? Thanks.
That's a very interesting question, and I don't have an immediate answer. But I think Shibata might be one connection that we can make because, Shibata, after kind of retiring from being a cinematographer, he started growing plants. Expensive plants like lilies and so he physically became a biologist, so to speak, which is a significant realm of bunka eiga in the 1930s, right? So science, to capture science in motion picture cameras, no, I'm just thinking out loud. No, I don't have a very specific answer at this point, but I think,
for one thing, the vector goes from France to Germany. So the bunka eiga was explicitly influenced by the culture film in Germany.
Right, yeah, it's a translation.
Especially the scientific ones. But Anne sounds like she's thinking a lot more about the pictorialism of the late 30s bunka eiga. And in that sense, that's probably something that entered Japanese cinema first through the films you're looking at, and then also the later pictorialism of, the Italian silent films and things like that, I bet.
Yeah.
Vesuvius. I'm not sure if Giorgio is here, but if he does, maybe he can pitch in later.
Yeah, photographic capture of Italian, right? Yeah, Giorgio's work. It was very important to construct my argument as well. So yeah, absolutely.
So we have here's a question from Yan Shuo. She says, thank you for the fascinating talk. I learned a lot from your lecture. How do you think we can place France's fascination over Japanese art within a larger context of appropriating Oriental cultures in the French Empire, particularly other so-called Oriental cultures, such as Egyptian native villages, which figured into the Expositions Universelles, the World Fair in Paris in the 19th century?
Yes.
Were there any interconnections between these different cultural representations in France? Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Japan was kind of exceptional in the Lumière experiments. Most of the other Lumière films shot outside of France was in French colonies. Egypt, French Indochina, like I said. In those films, French colonialism is more explicit. The French armies are shot, the native people are shot, or indigenous people are shot in a kind of colonial subjects, so to speak. So the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized are, like I said, more visible and explicit in those films, I think. But at the same time, the films shot in Egypt, for example, the layer issue, the composition issue that I talked about, it's also very visible as well. So in that sense, even though those films are shot in countries outside of France and Japan, I think there are connections between those films and Japonism in terms of the aesthetic composition and so on. So in that sense, the issue of colonialism is more complicated, so to speak. It's not only about those countries and France. Japan or the other cultures are working as a kind of a mediator between, in that colonial relationship between France and those countries. So that's an excellent question. And
it's also complicated by the Ainu films, which you do bring up in the book, which is another layer of complication, right?
Yes, yeah. So the colony inside of Japan and how the French people captures the colonialism of Japan as well, right?
Yeah. Matthew's back, and he says, very curious about the contrast between the second film shown, the ostensible Japanese meal, and the Lumiere's baby breakfast, in terms of action and composition. Do you have any comments about that?
Right, yeah. The Lumière baby film, it's in a little bit closer in terms of the camera position, right? And yeah, not just Orientalistic fantasy, but Constantino might have been thinking about showing the same baby action in a different locale. So in that sense, everydayness that we have, started to touch upon is foregrounded than the Orientalistic fantasy. Right. So it's a combination of Orientalism and everydayness in a French sense, so to speak. Right. Yeah, that's a very important issue to talk about as well. Speaking of Egypt and other colonial locations, my former colleague Michael Allen at the University of Oregon, he is also working on Lumière cinematographers, particularly those who went to French colonies. So yeah, I am curious about what he has to say about those cinematographers as well.
We don't have any more questions lined up. If you want to jump in, go ahead.
I have a question, actually. I'm sorry.
Oh, Reggie has a question.
Yeah, sorry. I can't. I'm a panelist technically, so I can't type in the Q&A.
Oh, jump in, please.
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
I don't need to start. I'm happy to, but so thank you so much for that incredibly interesting presentation. I have lots of questions, but there's two things in particular that were on my mind, and I'm glad that Marcus mentioned the Ainu films. And those of you from class, we'll talk about some of those later this semester. But I was really interested in what you were saying, about basically the kind of the gender and kind of maybe colonial Orientalist politics around, let's say, comportment. And I was wondering, like, what's attractive to someone like Weir, and part of it is sitting and what it means to capture this. But I want to kind of think a little bit about that alongside the Ainu films, particularly in terms of what Japan was doing around these kind of world's fairs and displaying Ainu as though they are not Japanese, and like that investment in a certain notion. So I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about the ways in which customs around, say, eating as they're staged are happening, those are playing out in the Lumière films, as opposed to, or in terms of the kind of, let's say, grammar of representation in the context of the Ainu kind of displays. Are customs treated the same way, or do you notice interesting details around that? That's
right.
That's the first thing, and then I have another one about just kind of about. And the second one is just about. I was struck by the kabuki performance. I work on No mainly, but also on dance and so forth. And I was just wondering because you started talking about framing and different, like basically planes and the importance of these different translations of linear perspective, you know, if there's writing around this time about different types of performing arts and how they might lend themselves or not to cinematic capture, because I was thinking about it, I know that the Momiji Gari, I mean, the earlier version is the no version, and a lot of the action is the same, but one of the things that it lacks is that actually kind of sense of layered kind of background, because you don't have that note in the same way. You have a physical prop that's not that's not inhabiting a kind of more two-dimensional representation. And so I wondered if there's, to what extent some of those types of staging techniques or kind of tendencies played into this idealized aesthetic that in some ways, you know, is actually privileging, say, a more kind of two-dimensionality.
Yeah, both of them are very insightful and intriguing questions. And the first one about Ainu, one thing that I can point out immediately is that I think the Japanese government was aware of what Constantia was doing, so to speak. So they were kind of using the foreigners' eyes to distinguish Ainu people from the Japanese people, to, you know, kind of construct the Japanese national identity. So in that sense, the colonial relationship is becoming more complicated, right? Using French cinematographers and their gaze to recreate or to internalize the Japanese Orientalism, so to speak, in Japan. So we should think about you know, the power relations between the French cinematographers, Japanese government, and Ainu in a, you know, different layers. About the second question, yes, there might have been a technological issues to recreate the kabuki stage. In that, well, speaking of Momijigari, you know, they didn't capture the entire performance inside of the kabukiza theater, you know, because of the lighting issue. You know, Shibata had to recreate the kabuki stage behind the kabukiza theater, so it was shot, you know, in an exterior location. So it's not the it tries to show that as, you know, as an inside of the kabukiza theater, but it's a recreation outside of the theater. So we should not only think about the, you know, aesthetic choice, but also we have to think about the technological choice that was available at that point. So in that sense, you know, the context of lighting and available film stocks is very important. We shouldn't just focus upon the you know, aesthetic context, but also, you know, we need to think about the technological aspect of it.
Also, the context of the shooting itself, because you could say that this really is film theater, because the filmmakers were very nervous because they were dealing with the biggest actors of the day who were giving them only like a little bit of their time to shoot this and go, right? So there's a famous story about the fan that flutters down. It's a mistake, right? They blew it. It's windy, it's outside, but they couldn't dare ask him to do it again. And so it's very different in the coming years when people are performing for the camera. They're actors, they're film actors at that point.
Right.
And they reshoot things, take multiple
the
takes.
moment of contingency, yes.
Yeah.
Also, Danjuro was not at that point allowing the film to be shown publicly.
Right.
The film, no matter what they were actually thinking, like, you know, exporting the film to Europe, Danjuro himself was, you know, he okayed to be shot only because for the, you know, educational purposes of the future generation of the kabuki performers, right? So it was not for the you know, paid exhibition, so to speak. So,
and then after that, that's the important context, I think, is reception, because it as it becomes capitalized and a popular entertainment, it's shown in the popular entertainment districts. So it becomes aligned with storytelling and popular kabuki and things like that, which I think really helps account for why for the first couple decades, the Japanese approach to fiction film, actually, and both for contemporary stories and jidaigeki, is flat, theatrical, deeply connected to kabuki gesture, not just narrative, but gesture and makeup and everything else.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't think there's probably much literature in the first 10 to 15 years that would help you answer the kind of questions that Reggie was asking. But after that, there's a lot, right? And
yeah, no, not many. But if you dig into the documents that, like, the historians like Tsukada mentions, and I've started doing a little, the newspapers in Hokkaido and those things, and the records of the missions in Hokkaido, and so there are some interesting finds, but that's another issue, the archiving and the archival research.
Okay, we've run out of time. I think we could go on and on and on. Listen, in 1995, I did this big retrospective for the Yamagata Film Festival on the birth of cinema. This is the 100th anniversary of the birth of cinema. And we looked so hard for people to write good articles for our catalog. And your book is exactly what we were looking for. It's 25 years late.
Lumière 125.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that was last year. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much for joining us. The book is out. I recommend it very, very highly. Thank you very much. Everyone give a big hand to Daisuke for joining us today.
Thank you so much for your invitation and the insightful questions and comments. I really, really appreciate that.
Next time we'll bring you to Ann Arbor.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, thank you.
All right, so long, everybody.